آزادی بیان.
言论自由
Free speech.
So I'm here with Wojciech Sadurski, who's a professor of law at the University of Sydney and the University of Warsaw. And he's a very vocal opponent of the ruling party in Poland right now, the Peace and Justice Party. And as a result of his outspoken criticism, he has faced 3 charges of defamation and slander. And his most recent case has included both a criminal charge, which if he had been convicted would have meant that he could have faced up to a year in prison. So I wonder if you could explain what these charges are and how this prevents the opposition from speaking out against the ruling party.
Well, in fact, a very, very minor and only a historical connection. So first of all, sorry, thank you very much for having me on this podcast. It's a pleasure and honor. Now, a tiny correction. In fact, I had 4 cases because I had also a case of alleged slander against Mr. Kaczynski, who is the main leader in Poland. But the case was discontinued at the stage of police and prosecutorial investigation. So just to add to the wealth of legal cases which are thrown at me, there were 4, but 1 is now sort of ticked off. I had a somewhat grotesque interrogation in Warsaw Office of Police, whether I meant to offend Mr. Kaczynski. I never knew the identity of a private person who lodged this application for investigation to the police, and the matter has been sort of discontinued. Now, I'm mentioning it for a purpose because even as we are speaking now, there is a very famous case investigated by Polish prosecutorial office, by public prosecution, against a very famous Polish writer and especially screenwriter. His name is Mr. Żulczyk, who allegedly offended President Duda. So it's not just my case. To give you a context, these days there are quite a number of slander/defamation cases going on against critics of the politicians. Now, going back to my cases, 3 cases are still ongoing at different stages of legal development. 1 is already very, very ripe. I would have thought that it was a final judgment in my favor. That was a case by the ruling party, Law and Justice, Polish acronym PiS. And I had the 2 instance proceedings all ending in my favor. So the judgment looked like a res judicata, like a final judgment. But just a few days ago, I found out that PiS lodged a request for special so-called cassation, which is extraordinary type of appeal to be considered by the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court will first consider whether to hear this cassation case, and that will be just 1 judge panel. So much depends on who that judge will be. And as you may know, Polish Supreme Court has now been thoroughly packed by PiS sympathizers. And depending on this preliminary decision, I still may face a 3-panel court in Supreme Court to consider alleged civil defamation of PiS. So this is the most ripe case, unfortunately not yet final. Then there are 2 other cases, both lodged by one and the same accuser/plaintiff. It is TVP, which is Polish state-run TV. It would be somewhat offensive to BBC to say that it's a Polish BBC. It is anything but BBC, but it's it styles itself, it positions itself as a Polish public TV. In fact, it's state-run, state-funded, and state-controlled TV. They, on the basis of one and the same blog entry, they both lodged against me civil defamation case, which I suppose is not particularly striking as such, but also criminal defamation. Polish criminal code has this unusual, very anachronistic provision about criminal defamation, which is one of very, very few cases of crimes which can be prosecuted on the basis of private prosecution. Normally, as all over the world, it is the state prosecutor who initiates the case. Here it is private prosecutor. So they are appearing both in two different cases, two parallel cases, and legally speaking, there is no connection between them whatsoever. They are both suing me under civil defamation provisions of the Civil Code, Article 24, and criminal defamation provision of Criminal Code, Article 212. So that gives you more or less, I think, a general landscape of my adventures with public law in Poland.
Thank you. And I wonder if you could maybe speak to the basis of those charges. So in one of the cases, you called the Polish state media Goebbelsian, I think in relation to their coverage or the lead up to the assassination of the liberal mayor of Gdansk, Paweł Adamowicz. And I wonder if you could sort of go a bit more into detail about what their coverage was like.
Sure. So strangely enough, although I used this admittedly very, very harsh description and epithet, but I stand by it because I think it has strong basis in facts. Nevertheless, the word Goebbelsian was not part of the private indictment. What they indicted me for, and also what they sued me in a civil case for, was my alleged suggestion that it was the coverage of TVP of Mr. Adamowicz policies which led to the murder. The coverage that TVP provided of the policies, of the alleged corruption cases, of personality and character of Mr. Adamowicz led to the tragic murder in the beginning of 2019, which is a sort of strange case. Now, I do not want to engage in my defense here in this podcast. It's not the right forum for it. But as a matter of fact, I didn't say that in so many words, certainly. What I did say is that media context of the crime has to be considered because it hasn't happened in a media vacuum. And I, in my speech before the court, in fact, in my two speeches before the courts of different instances, I provided analogy with the murder of JFK, who also wasn't murdered by media, but media context and the hate propaganda against him before his arrival in Dallas, Texas, cannot be simply disregarded and forgotten. And that's what I said, and I fully stand by. Now, they became very upset, and they were upset, meaning TVP, because of course I wasn't the only one to make that type of implications, and some other people, many of whom are my friends or colleagues, made these statements much more forcefully. They were all either sued or criminally indicted by TVP. There were about 30 journalists and public figures who were pursued or prosecuted by TVP. and TVP so far lost all the cases. I don't know whether some are still pending, but those cases which have been finalized, including against Polish Ombudsman, Professor Bodnar, they were all lost by TVP. Now, I have a dubious honor of being the only target of TVP who has been both criminally and civilly pursued, which is, again, legally speaking, it is permissible, it is strange, it is odd, to throw all these resources against one person on the basis of one and the same alleged offense. So my view is that as long as my case, or my various cases, 3 cases, are being and will be considered by fully independent judges, that I will win all the cases. Of course, every defendant says that, and you wouldn't have expected anything else from me. But now, if I manage to put my head as a scholar, including a scholar who has spent some time in his life studying matters of freedom of expression, both under First Amendment in the United States and more relevantly under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, I believe that none of my statements should attract either penalty or civil damages. I think that I acted fully within the limits protected by Article 10 and by Polish Constitution for that matter. I made very strong, harsh criticism, both of the ruling party and of TVP. And politically speaking, we are talking about one and the same entity or one and the same people. I mean, it's not like there is any independence of the TVP from the ruling party. This is the same ruling elite. I've been very harsh. I am very harsh. And as long as they continue their policies, I will be. I don't take away anything what I've said. So basically, when it comes to peace, my main, to law and justice, sorry, I'm used to this Polish acronym, which to an English speaker may be somewhat confusing. So regarding law and justice party, basically what I said was that their modus operandi resembles that of the criminal group. And it was, I think, a perfectly legitimate statement, because I showed how through quite complex coordination of different institutions and different officials, the parliament and the parliamentary majority, the government, the leadership of the party, the TV, and the president of Poland, how they managed to basically dismantle Polish constitutional democratic system. And I have devoted a book to it, both in English and in Polish. So I stand by it, and I can provide justification for a statement which compares this action, emphasizing the issue of coordination and synchronization, to a criminal group. Criminal because it is aimed at criminal purposes, namely abolition of democratic system, which is a crime in Poland. When it comes to TV, I have emphasized their totally one-sided propaganda, including in this case propaganda against Mayor of Gdańsk, who had been with reason depicted as a big enemy of the law and justice, with reason because he was very independent mayor, just as all mayors of all Polish cities these days are. And so the coverage was shocking and horrible. Just to give you and your listeners an idea, one of the top commentators on one of innumerable programs devoted to Adamowicz, there were about 1,800 of such programs in the year 2018, that is the year preceding the murder, compared Adamowicz to quote unquote cancer on the body of Polish democracy. And you know what you do with cancer. So, so this is just to give you the tone of their coverage. So I stand by my critique. I think it was a legitimate critique of matters of major public concern. I'm not interested and have been never interested in personal issues, in personal problems, unless they are relevant to the character of public figures. But again, I never wrote about it. I write about policies and politicians rather than about quote unquote typical defamation triggering issues.
Thank you. And I also was wondering if the fact that the other 30 cases that you alluded to, the individuals ended up being acquitted, does that speak to some level of judicial independence? And to what degree do you think that the Law and Justice Party has captured the judiciary?
Absolutely, it does speak to judicial independence. So what we have in Poland now is a total structural capture through various means which I may describe, but at the same time, strong independence by many individual judges. I mean, there are about 10,000 judges in Poland. So we are not talking about 15 judges of so-called constitutional tribunal. And we are not even talking about under 100 judges of 5 chambers of the Supreme Court. We are talking about regular judges, district judges, regional judges, judges of courts of appeal, and many of them, perhaps most, maintain independence. But that takes a great courage and risk-taking on their part, because structurally speaking, Law and Justice has established a very draconian set of rules concerning judicial conduct, including in the context of hearing cases, but also regarding public statements of judges, and has established an accompanying system of disciplinary procedures. So we have so-called disciplinary judges or prosecutors, whatever you call them. Polish word for it is not easily translatable into English legal language, who are basically persecuting judges for their judgments and other judicial decisions which are disliked by the ruling party. So some of the most iconic Polish judges who have been in the media recently, such as Judge Igor Tuleya or Judge Żurek, have been persecuted or prosecuted. I mean, in this case, this is one and the same really matter, for their judgments or for their judicial decisions within the processes. So rather than allowing a normal appellate procedure to verify, check, and remove potentially bad judgments, now we have a structure of harassing judges for their conduct. And I must say, with great sorrow, that a judge in my appellate hearing of TVP a few weeks ago, who has handed down a decision in my favor, and the decision accompanied by superb reasons referring directly to the European Convention and to the Constitution of Poland, which is not still very frequent among judges in Poland, that she has been immediately after subjected to hate campaign, both by TVP, which immediately the same day issued a public statement which it uploaded in its main page, using ad personam extremely strong epithets against this judge. So these were real invectives. It wasn't just, what you usually, when you lose a case, you say, well, with the greatest respect, I believe that judge was very wrong. That is perfectly acceptable. But these were epithets and invectives against her. And these were immediately picked up by pro-government right-wing propaganda in Poland. So that judge is now victim so far of the hate campaign. I have no idea whether it will be translated into any more real sanctions and penalties against her. I hope not, because I would feel, in a sense, indirectly guilty or responsible for that. But this is the situation in which Polish judges are. And you see, they know about it, but also we know about it, we being defendants, we being the parties. So when we come to the court, you think not only about, well, I wonder what judge will think about that argument or this argument of mine or of my lawyer. You also think, but where does this judge stand vis-a-vis the ruling party? Is he or she blacklisted? Will she suffer if she hands down a judgment which will be disliked? And if yes, what sort of consequences will she suffer? And the very fact that we know it's a public knowledge, fundamentally undermines judicial independence and therefore the minimal principles of the rule of law. I mean, there is a big debate now in the European Union about rule of law procedures and what does rule of law mean. And there are many scholars and politicians who say this and who say that, but whatever, and we can discuss as academics about the concept of rule of law for hours and hours, but some things are certain. There is a certain minimum about which no one can seriously discuss, and that is the judicial independence. The fact that a judge will not be harassed for the substance of her or his judgment is an irreducible minimum. We can agree about anything else, but someone who says this is not part of the rule of law has an extremely eccentric notion of the rule of law in the first place.
And to what degree is the general population aware of the lack of the rule of law, and to what degree are they concerned about it, or are they very supportive of the Law and Justice Party? And I guess a sort of connected question would be, is there any sort of independent media in Poland? Are there independent TV channels and newspapers that are actually able to counter some of these narratives?
Yeah, to your last question, the answer is unqualified yes. Yes, there are strong and well-regarded and popular independent media, both broadcast media, national commercial TV, in fact, two channels, one being more independent than another, but they are both quite independent of TVP and of the ruling party. And there are several print media. The main serious newspaper called Gazeta Wyborcza, and another important newspaper called Rzeczpospolita. They have good readership base, and they are independent and critical to a different degree, but they are critical of the government. So yes, people can form their opinion about both the assault on rule of law and about various corruption cases. These days, we are observing in Poland a developing quite horrible corruption among the top ruling elite, but this is another story. But going back to the beginning of your question, to what extent these issues, which are there for everyone to see, I mean, it's no longer a secret that judges are being manipulated by the public authorities. To what extent it affects popularity of the ruling party, here I'm afraid I need to be much more qualified and nuanced, only to some extent. And many people still vote for that party despite what is an obvious assault upon the rule of law. For some people, it simply is not a very important matter on their agenda. For some persons, it is actually a deserved fate of the judiciary, because the propaganda against judges had some effect. And there had been enormous propaganda, again, especially by state-run media, about alleged corruption by judges, about judges being arrogant, being insensitive to regular people, and occasional abominational cases, which you can find in every country, had been elevated to some sort of symbolic level, and they provided propaganda with, they were simply weaponized. And just one word about the propaganda. So it is not the case that we have in Poland a true free market of ideas. There are clear privileges for the state-owned media, both financially, but also in purely technical terms, in terms of their territorial coverage. So there are many areas where you can basically receive only TVP, plus some local stations which do not cover politics. In 2019, I had traveled around Poland a good deal and had several lectures and public meetings, also in very small places. And in the evenings, I came to my hotel, this hotel, another hotel. I turned TV on, and I realized that all that you can have there is TVP. So there are many people who are exposed to that type of propaganda, and we all know there is no prize for that discovery. Propaganda works. Propaganda works, may be effective. So imagine that in the United States, you have only Fox TV, but Fox TV, Fox News, but in its much harsher version, perhaps something like one of those alt-right type of, I don't know what it's called, media wars or things like that version. And that's all you have. And you watch it day after day after day, because for many people who are not politically active, this is part of their daily ritual. I mean, it must sink in. Occasionally, fortunately, it is counterproductive because it's now so primitive. So people resist, but not everybody.
One of the things that I think is interesting about your defamation cases are that they originated with posts that you made on Twitter. And I wonder if you could speak to the intersection between social media and the state's suppression of free speech. And you mentioned that there were a number of journalists and other high-profile individuals who were charged with defamation and slander. But to what degree are sort of lower profile individuals charged with sort of speech related crimes just based on posts that they might make on social media?
Well, it is still a very significant minority of cases. For example, these 30-odd cases which were initiated by TVP against its critics, almost all were about statements on traditional media, or for example, public statements by officials such as the ombudsman. So of course, they were also reported on social media, because all these, both journalists and public officials, they also have their accounts on Twitter or on Facebook. But if I remember well, most of the cases were based on, well, more traditional means of communication. When it comes to social media, I think that, and I do not have any particular profound views about it, but I would say two things. First is that as far as I personally am concerned, I cannot complain about any attempts of censor or silence me for what I'm saying on Twitter, perhaps because I really am not saying anything particularly outrageous or illegal. You know, I do not engage in hate speech. I do not engage in individual defamation, nothing like that. I have a reasonably good following. I have now about 40,000 followers on Twitter. I do not engage in Facebook at all, so I cannot complain. But, and there is always a but, and that's my second point, I can see that there is a growing trolling industry on Polish social media. I do not know to what extent these trolls are, say, originate in our eastern neighboring countries, say in Ukraine or especially in Russia. I think that when it comes to social media appearances of really important politicians and political parties, they are, it seems to me that I am regularly, especially when I make statements particularly unpopular by the government, that I'm occasionally assaulted by a trolling campaign. For example, I mean, I don't want to sound paranoid, and that obviously does sound paranoid, but I already noticed that when I upload a Twitter, a tweet with a particularly anti-law and justice party message, you know, I get for a few hours normal type of responses, positive, negative, no matter. And then at a certain point, usually a few hours later, I immediately get maybe 20, maybe 30 tweets, almost identical, extremely defamatory against me, and usually coming from accounts which have 1 follower, 2 followers, and with almost no tweets produced before. So, you know, you don't need to be particularly paranoid to see that there is a degree of action, and sort of they all come, say, within the space of 15, 20 minutes, and they go. Probably they move elsewhere. So there is a struggle, there is a fight going on there, and insofar as these actions may be traced to Russia, or say to Baltic states or Ukraine, but inspired by Russia, this becomes a very serious matter, because it becomes a matter of, if you like, call it informational security of Poland. And of the EU for that matter. I mean, there are studies within the EU, and fortunately the EU has been started doing something seriously about it in the recent months, to very seriously look at the information war initiated or operated by Russians.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other, I guess the question I have is, it actually strikes me as somewhat similar, or at least your case, being accused of something based on something you wrote on Twitter, strikes me as very similar to some of the things that are going on in Russia, where you have people who write something very innocuous on Facebook, Twitter, Vkontakte, and then individuals will complain to the authorities and then have cases opened against them, which I think very much does chill speech. And I wonder if in Poland, aside from these defamation cases, it seems that Article 196, which is Poland's blasphemy law, is increasingly being used. And if there are other laws that are being used to suppress speech that go beyond criticism of just the ruling party, particularly with religion or the Catholic Church?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, Polish penal code is replete with, is full of provisions which may be called dignitary offenses or offenses to sentiments. So there is an anti-blasphemy provision. There are provisions against slander of the president, which is a qualified version of ordinary slander. There are provisions against slander of public officials and public functionaries, which again is a qualified version of it. There is this defamation, which is initiated by private prosecution, but when it's done through media, it has a qualified version, and as you had said at the beginning, may land you in jail for up to 1 year. So yes, and there is an unusual provision of slandering of the good name of Poland, which doesn't have to be confused with an even more outrageous provision which become world famous or infamous about the implications or suggestions about Polish involvement in the Holocaust. That as a criminal provision has gone. But there is still a general provision against slandering the good name of Poland. So now these all provisions are completely anachronistic. And of course, anti-blasphemy blasphemy provision is anachronistic. Everywhere in the democratic world, whenever such provisions exist, they suffer a well-deserved desuetudo. They die out. They are basically not used. They should be removed from the books, but no one even thinks about it because everyone knows that it will not be used. Like in the UK, for example, where blasphemy hasn't been tried for the last 50 or 60 years, and just as in the United States for that matter. But now, and that was an idea which many of liberal lawyers, including myself, thought, well, these provisions, of course, the very fact they are there may have invidious effect, but fortunately, no one ever uses them against individuals. But that has all changed since late 2015, when Law and Justice came to power, and they became extremely enthusiastic in using those dignitary offenses provision, except for one, for the provision against hate speech against racial minorities, against based on gender, etc., not against sexual orientation, because it has not been included into the anti-hate speech provision. So here they are extremely reticent and speech protective. But when it comes to protection of the dignity of the president, as the ongoing case to which I had alluded earlier indicates, or good name of the nation, or religious sensibilities and feelings, the anti-blasphemy case, they are quite enthusiastic in prosecutions. Occasionally, it is just an indictment, but never goes to the court. It becomes sort of discontinued, but chilling effect is unquestionable.
Thank you. And I guess the last question, unless you have anything else to add, would be, what are you optimistic about the potential to undo some of the damage that the Law and Justice Party has done, or do you think that they'll continue to remain in power?
Well, they definitely will continue to remain in power until 2023, which is the when current term of office of the parliament expires, and until 2024 when the term of office of the president expires. So I do not think that they will think about early elections. That would be folly, especially after or still in the midst of pandemic or just after, because they showed total ineptitude in dealing with the pandemic, a shocking ineptitude. But that, of course, is another matter. I do not see any other way for Poland to change its current authoritarian populist system than through the elections. Of course, there are some factors which will facilitate the democratic victory in the elections. One is the continuation of the strong grassroots movement against the government, of the sort that we have seen in late 2020 and beginning of 2021, as movements of protests, mainly of women, but also of men, against the anti-abortion judgment of the so-called Constitutional Tribunal. This could have been seen as a single issue campaign, but in fact it wasn't, and it's going on. So I think that certainly the social movements, especially if they institutionalize and accompany more traditional and often quite lazy opposition parties, will be one factor. And another factor will be, excuse me, response by the European Union. And we are yet to see the first truly important judgment of the Court of Justice, namely on the so-called disciplinary chamber of the Supreme Court. We have an interim judgment, which is a good judgment, but it's only interim judgment, so it has been completely disregarded and sidelined by the government. But when the judgment on merits comes, and it should come in the next 2-3 months, then it will completely change the external parameters within which the Supreme Court in Poland operates. So the actions, legal actions by the European Union, and I just gave an example of judgments in plural of the Court of Justice, but there are also other mechanisms, such as so-called rule of law framework, now sort of defunct, but which can be always reactivated. And in particular, the so-called Article 7 procedure, which may end with strong reputational costs for Poland, all that put together and then accompanied by some judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, which of course, legally speaking, is a completely different structure, but which has to be seen in this context. I mean, there are cases which start being heard by the European Court of Human Rights under Article 6, which is about the right to legal protection, and which start questioning the status of badly appointed judges, the nominees of the party. So all that will not restore democracy and the rule of law in Poland per se, but certainly will raise political costs for the ruling party of going on with their policy. But I have no illusions. They will go ahead with their policies. They will not moderate it. They still have a few things in their minds to do. They will try to complete the capture of all courts after having captured Constitutional Tribunal and the Supreme Court. So all these 10,000 judges will be subjected to completely new structural design, which already has been leaked to media, and which will make control of the judges by politicians much easier. They will try to reduce the powers of mayors of big cities, especially financial means from the coming from the European Union, because as I had said also, all mayors of all major Polish cities, including Warsaw, Gdańsk, Krakow, Poznań, Lublin, you name it, are now controlled by anti-law and justice party mayors. So since they cannot change those mayors, they will reduce their powers, and they are already doing it. They will certainly increase pressure on NGOs. I'm on the controlling bodies of two major Polish NGOs, Helsinki Foundation, Polish branch, and the Institute of Public Affairs. And I can tell from the inside how the increasing control and repressions in a Russian/Hungarian style are affecting our activities. And most importantly of all, those independent commercial media. And they have a plan. The plan is not the good old style censorship. They won't do it. It's too difficult and too visible. What they do is that they will be buying out those media which are still independent. They will be offering good price. They have a lot of money through state-owned banks and other companies. They have already tried it successfully. They will be making good offers to the owners. They will be reducing the value of those media. And the main way in which they will be doing it, that is subjecting independent media to further control, to stronger control, is through changing ownership regulations, through various restrictions on cross-ownership and foreign ownership. They will be buying out media which are partly owned by foreign companies, and they will turn them into pro-governmental media. They've done it already with a number of regional newspapers. Now they will certainly move on to national media, both print media and broadcast media.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation and for taking the time to talk to me. I really hope that we can continue this conversation further.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure talking to you.